In World War II, American airmen swore an oath to die before letting one secret fall into enemy hands. It wasn't a code, but a 50-pound box of gears and gyros. The Germans laughed at early American bombing efforts. They stopped laughing when a brilliant, stubborn inventor used a spinning top to paralyze their war machine. You've heard of the B-17, but the real marvel of the air war was a device so precise, crews claimed they could hit a pickle barrel. But its true genius was a secret that's still misunderstood today. In the history of warfare, there are moments that change everything. We often think of the weapons themselves, the first tank, the atomic bomb, the jet engine. But sometimes, the true revolution isn't the weapon, but the tiny, ingenious device that tells it where to go. In the Second World War, American airmen were sent into the skies of Europe with a promise. They were told they were not carpet bombers, they were surgical strikers. And the tool that was meant to make this promise real was a 50-pound box of gears, lenses, and gyroscopes known as the Norden Bombsight. It was a piece of technology so secret, bombardiers swore an oath to protect it with their lives. And it was a device so advanced, the Germans, at first, simply laughed at the claims made about it. They scoffed at the idea of precision daylight bombing. It was impossible, they said, a fool's errand. They continued scoffing right up until their most critical factories, the ones they believed were safe, began disappearing in plumes of smoke. The story of the Norden Bombsight is not just about a clever invention. It's a story about a clash of philosophies, the brutal reality of war, and the misunderstood genius of a little spinning top that quite literally stabilized the Allied war effort. To understand the Norden, we must first understand the problem. And the problem is gravity. It's a simple, brutal force. If you are standing still on the ground and drop a rock, it falls at your feet. But if you are in an airplane, moving at over 200 miles an hour, 3 miles up in the sky, that rock will not land where you dropped it. It will land miles ahead of you. The airmen of the First World War learned this the hard way. Their first bombs were little more than artillery shells with fins dropped by hand over the side of a rattling biplane. The pilot would guess. He'd feel the wind, look at the ground, and let go, hoping for the best. The results were, to put it mildly, abysmal. They were lucky to hit the right town, let alone the right building. This was not a science, it was guesswork. But after that first Great War, a new and dangerous idea began to take hold in military circles. Thinkers like WWII in Italy and our own Billy Mitchell here in the States proposed a radical new doctrine. They argued that wars would no longer be won by armies clashing in muddy trenches. The next war, they said, would be won from the air. They envisioned massive fleets of bombers flying deep into enemy territory to destroy the heart of their war-making ability, their factories, their rail yards, their power plants. If you could break the industry, they argued, you would break the army, and you would break the will of the people to fight. It was a terrifying, revolutionary idea. However, it had a massive, unanswered question at its core. How? How do you actually hit a factory from 20,000 feet? The British, remembering the terror of the Zeppelin raids over London, came to one conclusion. You couldn't. Not reliably, not at night, and not through the miserable weather of Northern Europe. So they invested in heavy night bombers, the Lancasters and Halifaxes, with the goal of area bombing. Their target was not a single factory, but the entire industrial district and the city that surrounded it. It was a grim, blunt force strategy born of perceived necessity. But America, separated by an ocean and with a different industrial and moral outlook, refused to accept this. The U.S. Army Air Corps, led by men who were themselves pilots, believed in a different path. They believed in the heavy, well-defended daylight bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and they believed in precision. They made a moral and strategic wager that American boys would not be sent to level cities. They would be sent to destroy specific, critical targets, leaving the surrounding civilian areas untouched. This was a noble goal, but it was a goal that rested entirely on a piece of technology that did not yet exist. They needed a bombsight that could do what no bombsight had ever done. They needed a mechanical brain that could see the target, calculate the wind, the speed, the altitude, and drop a bomb with pinpoint accuracy. They needed the Norden. The quest for this perfect bombsight became one of the great technological races of the 1920s and 30s. The U.S. Navy, which was actually far ahead of the Army in this field, had two primary contractors. The first was the brilliant Elmer Sperry, a man already world-famous for his work with gyroscopes. Sperry had tamed the sea, creating the gyro compass and ship stabilizers that kept battleships steady in rough water. He was a wizard of electrical systems, and his approach was to use a series of electrically driven gyros to create a complex but effective bombsight. But the Navy was hedging its bets. They had another inventor, a man who was, in many ways, Sperry's complete opposite. His name was Carl Norden. Carl Lucas Norden was a Dutch immigrant, a quiet, intensely serious engineer who had come to America and dedicated his life to mechanical precision. He was a small, neat man, almost always seen in a suit, and he was known for being stubborn, secretive, and an absolute perfectionist. Many viewers of our generation remember men like this, men who built the modern world with slide rules and calipers, men who trusted the tolerances of a well-milled piece of steel more than a flickering electrical current. Norden distrusted Sperry's complex electrical devices. He believed they were too fragile for the rigors of combat. He put his faith in pure mechanics, in the predictable, timeless dance of gears and levers. The Navy, in its wisdom, set these two geniuses in direct competition. They gave both Sperry and Norden contracts to develop a new generation of bombsight. The race was on. Norden's early models, like the Mark III, were impressive. They were essentially very sophisticated analog computers. The bombardier would manually input data, the plane's altitude, its airspeed, the direction of the wind, the type of bomb. The sight, through a complex series of gears, would then show the bombardier the correct drop angle. But the core problem remained, the human. The bombardier still had to manually fly the plane toward the target using the sight, trying to keep the crosshairs steady while the plane was being tossed around by turbulence. It was better than dropping bombs by hand, but it was not the revolution the Air Corps was dreaming of. And this is where the Germans, who were developing their own sights, like the Lot-Fernrohr 7, felt they were on the right track. Their sight was simpler, but it did the same basic job. It was a good calculator. American observers, however, knew this wasn't enough. The problem wasn't just calculating the drop point. The problem was stabilizing the platform. And that is where Carl Norden's true genius and the secret that would eventually humble the German war machine came into play. The secret was the gyroscope. If you've ever held a spinning bicycle wheel by its axle or played with a simple toy top, you have felt the strange, magical force at the heart of the Norden bombsight. A spinning wheel, a gyroscope, does two remarkable things. The first is called rigidity in space. Once you get it spinning at high speed, it wants to stay pointing in the exact same direction no matter how you move the frame it's in. You can tilt your hand, but the wheel itself will fight to stay put, aligned with the stars. The second, and more mysterious property, is precession. If you try to force the spinning gyro to tilt, it does something strange. It doesn't push back directly. Instead, it moves at a right angle to the force you applied. It's this weird, slow, predictable wobble. These two principles are the bedrock of modern navigation. Elmer Sperry had used them to guide ships, but Carl Norden would use them to create a patch of perfect stillness in the middle of a chaotic sky. The problem, as Norden saw it, was that the airplane itself was the enemy of accuracy. A B-17 on its bomb run is not a stable platform. It is a thin, aluminum tube riding on waves of air, being rocked by turbulence, nudged by winds, and worst of all, violently hammered by the explosions of anti-aircraft flak. asking a bombardier to hold a crosshair on a target the size of a building, miles below, for 30 or 40 seconds in this environment was not just difficult, it was functionally impossible. The human hand, the human eye, simply isn't steady enough. So Norden decided to take the human out of the equation. His solution was the Norden Mark XV bombsight, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Mark XV was really two devices in one. The first part was the calculator, the brains we talked about, but the second part, the revolutionary part, was the stabilizer head. This head contained the sight itself, the telescope the bombardier looked through. But this telescope was not bolted to the floor of the plane. Instead, it was mounted on a special platform. That platform was controlled by two powerful, high-speed gyros. One gyro was set to detect pitch, the plane's nose-up or nose-down movement. The other was set to detect roll, the tilting of the wings. Now here is the genius of Carl Norden. He wasn't an electrical engineer, like Sperry. He was a master of mechanics. He designed a system where the precession of those gyros, that tiny 90-degree wobble, was harnessed. The instant the plane's wing dipped, the roll gyro would sense the change. It would try to stay rigid in space. This would cause it to precess. That tiny precession movement was mechanically linked to a set of air valves. Think of them like the valves on a trumpet. This tiny movement would open or close the valves, and a high-pressure stream of air, fed by the plane's superchargers, would rush through them. This air, in turn, drove a set of small, powerful pistons, and those pistons were connected to the sight platform. The result was a beautiful, instantaneous analog feedback loop. The wing dips, the gyro precesses, the valve opens, the piston moves, and the bombsight itself tilts in the exact opposite direction, perfectly, instantly, and automatically, canceling out the plane's motion. To the bombardier peering through the eyepiece, the effect was pure magic. While the plane around him might be shaking and rattling, the image in his telescope, the crosshairs and the tiny, distant factory below, was perfectly, uncannily still. It was as if the B-17 had been frozen in a block of ice, suspended motionless in the sky. He had his patch of stillness. But Norden didn't stop there. He had solved the problem of stability. Now he would solve the problem of the human hand. He linked this stabilized platform to the plane's own autopilot. This was the final, critical piece. On the final bomb run, the bombardier wasn't just looking at the target, he was flying the plane. He would use two small knobs on the bomb sight to make tiny, precise adjustments. He wasn't steering the plane directly, he was steering the sight. He would turn the course knob until the vertical crosshair was locked on the target. Then, as the plane flew closer, he would adjust the rate knob, which controlled the speed of the crosshairs until they were moving at the exact same speed as the target on the ground. When the crosshairs were locked, he would flip a switch, and from that moment on, the Norden was the pilot. The bombsight itself, through its gyros and mechanical linkages, was now sending signals to the autopilot, making microscopic adjustments to the B-17's rudder and elevators. It was flying the plane with a precision no human pilot could ever hope to match. The bombardier's job was now just to watch. He would peer into his telescope, watching the unmoving crosshairs drift slowly, perfectly, toward the target. When the calculated drop angle matched the angle of the sight, an electrical contact would close, the bombs would release automatically. He never had to touch a thing. This was the revolution. It was a synchronous bomb sight. It didn't just calculate the drop, it flew the plane to the perfect release point. It was, in effect, the world's first true smart weapon. The U.S. military knew exactly what it had. This was not just an improvement, this was a war-winning secret. And they guarded it with an obsession that bordered on paranoia. The Norden bombsight became the most classified, most protected piece of equipment in the entire American arsenal. When not in use, the sights were stored in bomb-proof, air-conditioned vaults on the air bases under 24-hour armed guard. When a mission was scheduled, an armed officer would check the sight out to the bombardier, who would sign for it as if it were a bar of gold. He would carry it in a canvas bag, handcuffed to his wrist, to the waiting B-17. The sight would be installed on the plane under a black shroud, and only then would the handcuffs be removed. But the most extreme measure was the oath. Every bombardier had to swear a solemn oath, not just to protect the sight, but to die for it. The training was explicit. If the plane was going down over enemy territory, the bombardier's first duty was not to bail out. His first duty was to destroy the Norden. He was to fire his .45 caliber pistol into the lens and the gyro housing. If that failed, he was to use a small incendiary charge, a thermite grenade, packed inside the sight's case to melt it into a block of useless slag. And if all else failed, he was to ride the plane down, sacrificing his own life to ensure the secret never fell into enemy hands. This was the burden placed on these young men, most of them barely out of their teens. They were guardians of the sacred sight. This secrecy, of course, was a powerful tool for propaganda. The Army Air Forces needed to sell this new, dangerous, and unproven strategy of daylight bombing to the American public and to a skeptical British ally. They needed a legend, and the Norden provided it. The press was filled with stories, fed by the Air Corps, of the Norden's unbelievable accuracy. This is where the famous phrase was born: "We can drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet." It was a brilliant piece of marketing. It captured the imagination. It painted a picture of American ingenuity and, just as importantly, American morality. We weren't the city busters of the night. We were surgical specialists. We were the good guys. And in the clear, calm skies of the American desert during training, the myth seemed true. On practice ranges in Nevada or Texas, with no wind, no clouds, and no one shooting back, a good bombardier could put a bomb within a 100-foot circle. The device worked. The pickle barrel was, at least, plausible. This is what the public was told. It's what the crews wanted to believe. And it's what the Germans heard. And they laughed. German intelligence, which was excellent, knew all about the American claims. They had their own bomb sights, primarily the Luftwaffe 7, or Lot 7. It was a much simpler device. It was a pursuit sight, meaning the bombardier had to manually keep the target centered. It had no stabilization. It had no autopilot link. It was, in their view, a practical, simple, and effective tool. When they heard about the American wonder weapon the pickle barrel boasts, they dismissed it as crude American propaganda. Their engineers argued that such a complex, delicate, and heavy device would never survive the rigors of combat. It was a fantasy. They scoffed. The early American raids in 1942 and early 1943 over occupied France seemed to prove them right. The bombing was okay. It was better than what the British were achieving at night, to be sure, but it was nowhere near a pickle barrel. The Germans remained unimpressed. They believed their own simpler technology was superior. They were confident that their critical war factories deep inside the Reich were safe. But then, the air war escalated. The 8th Air Force began its full-scale assault on the heart of Germany, and the brutal, unforgiving reality of combat came crashing down on the myth of the Norden bombsight. The first and greatest enemy of the Norden was not a Messerschmitt or a flak gun. It was the weather. The Norden Mark XV was a visual bombsight. The bombardier had to see the target. And in Northern Europe, for most of the year, the ground is completely obscured by a thick, soupy, industrial gray layer of overcast. A bombardier sitting in his plexiglass nose cone would fly for 6 hours deep into Germany, enduring frostbite and fighter attacks, only to arrive over the target and see nothing, a solid floor of white. On those days, the multi-million-dollar B-17 formations, protected by the $8,000 bomb sight, which, remember, cost as much as 10 new cars, were reduced to the World War I-era tactic of bombing on the leader. The lead plane would guess, and everyone else would drop their bombs when they saw his fall. The pickle barrel became an entire county. But even on a clear day, the Norden faced its second great enemy, the human element, under fire. The Norden's genius was its autopilot link, but that genius came at a terrible price. To work, the Bombsight required the B-17 to fly perfectly straight and level for the last 30 to 60 seconds of the bomb run. This was the run-up. For a bombardier, this was the most terrifying minute of his life. As soon as the plane leveled off, the German flak gunners on the ground knew exactly what was happening. They had their predictors. They knew the plane's speed, its altitude, and its course. And for the next 30 seconds, that plane could not deviate. It was a sitting duck, locked into its path by its own magic bombsight. We can only imagine the hell that erupted in the sky. The air would become thick with black puffs of smoke, each one a flak shell exploding, sending thousands of red-hot metal shards tearing through the aluminum skin of the planes. Men who survived it described it as walking through a steel cloud. The planes would be violently bucked and thrown. Men would be wounded or killed at their stations. And through it all, the bombardier had to stay calm. He had to keep his eye pressed to the telescope, his hands delicately on the knobs, trusting the gyros to do their work. The psychological pressure was immense. Many bombardiers simply couldn't take it. They would toggle the bombs early just to let the pilot take control and start jinking or evasive action. They would sacrifice accuracy for the simple, desperate human need to move. The 8th Air Force, in its secret post-mission analyses, was discovering the grim truth. The pickle barrel was a complete myth. In 1943, during the brutal raids on the Schweinfurt ball bearing plants, studies showed that only about 20% of the bombs dropped were landing inside the target area, a circle with a radius of several thousand feet. Not the factory, the area. The rest were scattered for miles. The raids were costly. The losses in men and machines were staggering, and the Germans, noting the widespread inaccurate bombing, felt their initial scoffing was entirely justified. The Norden, it seemed, was a failure, an overly complex, expensive, and fragile toy that couldn't deliver on its one big promise. But this is where the Germans made their second and far more fatal miscalculation. They, and even many Americans, misunderstood what the Norden's true value was. It wasn't about hitting a pickle barrel. It was about allowing a new kind of war. The Germans had, in fact, captured the plans for the Norden bombsight years earlier. In 1938, a German-American spy named Hermann Lang, who actually worked at the Norden factory, had smuggled the complete blueprints back to Germany. The German High Command gave them to their own engineers. The engineers studied them and sent them back. They reported that the device was too complex, too delicate, and too difficult to mass produce. They didn't believe it could work, and they were content with their own simpler Lot Phase 7 sight. They had the keys to the kingdom, and they threw them away because they couldn't see the true purpose of the lock. They thought the Norden was just a calculator. They failed to understand the power of the stabilized gyro platform. American air power doctrine was not built on a single plane hitting a single barrel. It was built on the combat box, a massive formation of hundreds of B-17s flying wingtip to wingtip, designed for mutual defense. The goal was not for one bombardier to hit the target. The goal was for the lead bombardier in the very best crew to have the steadiest platform possible. The Norden's gyro-stabilized system, even in the chaos of a flak-filled sky, gave that lead bombardier a chance. It gave him that patch of stillness. When his bombs dropped, every other bombardier in the formation would drop theirs at the same instant. This was pattern bombing, and the result was not one bomb hitting a barrel. The result was 2,000 bombs hitting a single square mile all at once. This is what the Germans had failed to anticipate, and in 1944 and 1945, they paid the price. The 8th Air Force had learned its lessons. They knew the pickle barrel was a myth. They stopped targeting tiny individual buildings. Instead, they focused on choke points. These were the large, vital industrial complexes that the German war machine could not live without. The Luna synthetic oil refineries, the VKF ball-bearing plants in Berlin, the massive rail yards at Hamm. These targets were not barrels, but they were still small, measured in city blocks, not in entire cities. And this is where the Norden and its gyros finally delivered the knockout blow. On those days when the weather did break, when the clouds parted and the bombardiers could see the ground, the combat boxes would fly in. The lead bombardier, his eye pressed to the Norden, would guide the entire formation. The gyros would absorb the flak, holding the crosshairs steady. He would make his adjustments, the sight would take control, and for 30 long seconds, an entire armada of 1,000 planes would fly as one. Then the bombs would fall. A single, concentrated, devastating carpet of high explosives. The Germans who scoffed were not prepared for this. A British Lancaster raid at night might scatter bombs across half of Berlin, but a B-17 raid, on a clear day, could and did erase an entire factory complex from the face of the earth, while leaving the surrounding neighborhoods relatively untouched. The scoffing stopped. It was replaced by panic. Albert Speer, Hitler's brilliant minister of armaments, wrote about this extensively after the war. He said the night bombing by the British was a terror, but it was not decisive. It was the daylight precision attacks by the Americans that crippled the Third Reich. He wrote that the raids in 1944 on the synthetic oil plants were the single most important factor in Germany's defeat. With no fuel, the new tanks couldn't move. The new jet fighters couldn't fly. The entire war machine, the one that had conquered Europe, sputtered and died. The gyro-stabilized bombsight had done its job. It hadn't hit the pickle barrel. It had hit the factory that made the barrels, and that, it turned out, was all that mattered. It's this level of technical detail that often gets lost in the big war movies, the stories of heroism and sacrifice. But the technology itself is a fascinating story. If you've ever had a question about a piece of history like this, perhaps something you remember your father or grandfather mentioning, let us know in the comments. We read all of them, and it's where we get our best ideas for these deep dives. The men who flew those missions, the bombardiers, had a complicated relationship with the Norden. They knew its flaws. They cursed it when it was cloudy. They were terrified by the long, straight bomb-on. But they also respected the machine. They were, in a way, the first generation of a new kind of warrior, one who placed his faith not just in his own skill, but in the perfection of an analog computer. They were partners with this 50-pound box of magic.
The legacy of the Norden, as it turns out, is as complex as the device itself. After the war, it was quickly made obsolete. The jet age, radar bombing, and then computers changed everything. But the idea at the heart of the Norden, the gyro-stabilized platform, became the foundation for all modern navigation. The guidance systems that took the V-2 rocket, the first intercontinental ballistic missiles, and eventually the Apollo missions to the moon were all direct descendants of the same mechanical principles that Carl Norden had perfected in his New York workshop. The spinning tops that guided bombs to Berlin were the grandfathers of the spinning tops that guided Neil Armstrong to the Sea of Tranquility. But the Norden also left a darker, more ironic legacy. It was a machine built on a profound moral promise to make war less terrible by making it more precise, to spare the innocent. But the war didn't allow for that. When the weather was bad, which was most of the time, the Air Corps eventually turned to H-2X radar bombing. The radar was a blurry, imprecise tool. The Norden was slave to it, and the bombardier was, once again, just guessing. The precision doctrine gave way to the grim reality of area bombing. And then the final chilling irony. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay flew over the city of Hiroshima. The bombardier, Thomas Farabee, peered through his bomb sight. It was a Norden Mark XV. He lined up the crosshairs on the IOE bridge, the aiming point. The sight took control. The bomb bay doors opened and the little boy atomic bomb fell away. A device built for surgical precision was used to deliver a weapon of total, indiscriminate annihilation. The target was not a factory, it was an entire city. The Norden had worked perfectly. The paradox was complete. The Norden bombsight was a machine born of a noble idea that technology could make war civilized, but in the end, it was just a tool. And it became a tool that helped usher in a new, more terrifying age of warfare, one that we are all still living with. It was a bridge from the old world to the new, a brilliant, flawed, and fateful invention. The story of the Norden is, in many ways, the story of 20th century technology. It's a tale of genius, of obsession, and of the profound, often tragic gap between our intentions and our results. If you enjoyed this story, and we hope you did, the best way to support this channel is to share this video with a friend or family member, anyone who appreciates history as much as you do. It's how we grow, and it's how we're able to keep making these stories for you. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next one.